The climb begins not with a decision, but with a stirring, a slow rise from the warm hollow of your straw pallet in the barrack room, where the other archers still breathe in the deep rhythm of sleep. You pull on your woolen tunic in the dark, the fabric still holding the faint shape of yesterday, and lace your boots with fingers that move from memory. The tallow candle on the ledge beside the door has burned down to a stub, but still holds a small tongue of light, and you lift it carefully, shielding the flame with a cupped palm as you pass through the low archway into the stairwell. The steps spiral upward against the inner curtain wall, worn into smooth hollows by generations of boots before yours, and the candlelight pushes the shadows back just enough to show each next landing. Your breath makes a soft mist in the stair as the air cools with every turn, carrying the smell of old lime wash and the faint metallic tang of damp iron from the gatehouse below. You hear the slow drip of water, somewhere deep in the stone, a single note repeated at long intervals, and the sound of your own footfalls hushing against the treads. At the top of the stairs a wooden door stands half open onto the wall walk, and you push it with your shoulder, stepping out into a world that has not yet decided to wake. The morning mist lies on the parapet like a grey wool blanket pulled up to the merlons, soaking into the mortar and beading on the crenellations with tiny drops that catch the dying candle flame and then go dark again. You blow out the candle with a soft puff and set the warm stub on a stone ledge inside an arrow loop, where its thin trail of smoke rises, bends in the drift of air, and disappears. Now you stand still and let the cold settle over you, feeling it first on your cheeks and then on the backs of your hands where the gloves leave a narrow gap. The stone beneath your palms is coarse and wet, peppered with tiny chips of flint that glint like frozen stars when your angle catches the first hint of light. You draw a long breath through your nose, tasting the mist with its blend of wet wool, old oak from the timber hoardings further along the wall, and the faintest suggestion of smoke from the village that must be stirring its hearths somewhere beyond the curve of the valley. There is no wind, only a stillness so complete that you can hear the blood moving in your own ears, a soft and steady susurrus like the echo of a distant sea. You let your gaze travel outward over the battlement. The countryside below is still submerged in night shadow and mist, revealing itself in fragments as the sky lightens almost imperceptibly. First you can make out the dark smudge of a hedgerow running east to west, then the slightly paler strip of the road cutting through the fallow fields, and finally the individual crowns of oak trees in the wood beyond, their bare branches penciled against the grey. Nothing moves in all that spread of land, save a single flap of a raven's wing far off, a black shape lifting and settling again into the top of a dead elm. You watch the spot until the bird merges with the gloom, and then you turn your attention to your immediate surroundings with the same unhurried care. The wall walk here is narrow, just wide enough for two men to pass if they turn sideways, and you stand at a point where it jogs slightly to follow the contour of the hill. On your left, the inner edge drops away into the ward, still full of night except for a single orange flicker from the gatehouse lantern. On your right, the outer parapet rises to chest height, each merlon a block of grey limestone capped with darker slabs to shed the rain. Moss grows in the joints between the stones, soft as velvet, and a single yellow leaf from last autumn still clings to a thread of creeper, quivering with emotions so fine that it might be the breath of the castle itself. You unsling your bow from your shoulder and lean it carefully into the embrasure, the yew-belly resting against the stone with a sound like a soft knock on old wood. The quiver follows, its leather strap curling across the rough edge, as if it had always lived there, and you take a moment to settle the arrows so they will not rattle with every shift of your weight. Then you place both gloved hands on the stone and let your shoulders drop, feeling the tension of the dark climb drain out through your arms into the wall, absorbed by centuries of stone that have borne the weight of watchers before you. The eastern sky begins its slow transformation now, and you give it your full attention because there is nothing else to give it to. A line of charcoal grey at the horizon thins and softens into a band of slate, then ash, then a colour that is not yet blue, but holds the memory of blue somewhere inside it. The stars that had pricked the high dome above you fade one by one, not winking out, but simply becoming part of the lighter background, as if they have dissolved into milk. The mist in the fields below thickens for a moment, as if drawing a deep breath. then begins to pull apart into shreds that drift eastward on a current of air so gentle you cannot feel it on your face. You notice the cold now, not as a discomfort, but as a companion, a layer between your skin and the tunic that you will carry with you for hours. You tuck your chin deeper into the collar of your hood and feel the rough wool rasp against your stubble, a sensation so ordinary that it anchors you in the present. The mist condenses on the fabric of your hood and on the bowstring, coating the hemp with a fine dew that you will later wipe away with a scrap of linen kept for that purpose. For now you simply observe it, the way a farmer observes the dew on his crop in the first light, asking nothing of it. Down in the ward a cockerel crows, a sound that climbs the stones like a ladder and then flings itself out over the wall to the fields beyond, where no answering call returns. The silence after the crow is deeper than before, a silence that seems to have its own texture, like the surface of a very still pond. You have known a great many mornings on these battlements, and each one has its own variation of this silence, its own particular weight and taste. Today it tastes of wet limestone and the afterthought of the candle smoke on your fingers, and it weighs no more than a blanket that you could shrug off if you chose. Behind you the castle begins to assemble its morning sounds with the slow deliberation of a great beast waking. You hear the distant thud of a wooden bar being lifted from its brackets in the gatehouse, then the low murmur of voices exchanging the password and the password reply in syllables that blur into the stone. The scullery door opens and closes with its familiar groan, and a chain clinks as the bucket descends into the well, pausing at the waterline with a hollow splash that echoes up through the layers of masonry. You do not turn to look. You have seen this 100 times, and the sound picture in your mind is more complete and more restful than any glance could be. The light continues to climb, coaxing color out of the world, one patch at a time. The fields that were grey turn brown and gold in their separate strips, the stubble of the harvested wheat pale as oat straw, the fallow land a richer umber where the plough had turned it a month ago. The low stone walls between the strips emerge as faint blue lines, and the river beyond them becomes visible first as a gleam of polished metal, then as a meandering shape with a fringe of bare alders on either bank. You trace its path with your eye, following the bend west toward the watermill, whose wheel stands still because the miller has not yet opened the sluice gate. The mill itself is a squat cube of grey stone with a roof of mossy thatch, and from this distance it looks like a toy you could cup in your palm. Your gaze returns to the road, which is the reason you are here. It comes from the east, climbing out of a belt of woodland and crossing the open ground in a straight line for half a mile before curving behind a low hill and disappearing toward the village. From this height, you can see the entire stretch where an army would become visible, a pale gash of dried mud and packed chalk that in the morning light looks empty enough to make the whole notion of a siege feel like a rumor whispered by the wind. You scan it anyway, letting your eyes travel its length with the same methodical slowness you always use, and find nothing but a fox trotting across at a diagonal with its brush low, vanishing into the hedge without a sound. The act of watching settles into your bones now as a steady state, not a task to be performed, but a posture of existence. You breathe with the wall, or so it feels after the first hour, your inhalation matching the faint rise of the mist, and your exhalation the slow settling. The cold stone under your hands grows no warmer, but your hands grow accustomed to it, and the boundary between you and the parapet blurs into something shared. An observer from below might have seen a figure so still that it could have been carved from the same grey limestone, only the occasional shift of a foot or the adjustment of a strap betraying life. Your thoughts, when they come, are not the sharp, anxious thoughts of day, but the loose, drifting images of a mind half in dream. You think of the bread waiting in your pouch, a dense, dark rye with a crackled crust that will taste of the hearth it baked beside. You think of the way the candle flame bowed sideways on the stair, and the exact shape of the wax drips that cooled on the stone sill. You think of your father sharpening a scythe in a yard years ago, the whetstone ringing in steady strokes, though you do not follow the memory any deeper than that single sound. These thoughts rise and pass like clouds reflected in still water, leaving no wake. A thread of spider silk drifts across the embrasure, catching the new light and turning it into a line of silver. You watch it travel from Merlin to Merlin on a breath of air too fine to feel, and when it touches your sleeve you let it stay there, a tiny gossamer bridge between you and the wall. The spider that cast it is somewhere in a crack beneath your elbow, invisible and patient, spinning without hurry. You admire the economy of the creature, its understanding of waiting built into every strand of silk, and then you let the thought drift away with the mist. The first real sound of the morning that comes from outside the castle reaches you when the rooks in the wood begin their slow, circling arguments. Their calls are distant and rough, a chiding caw that repeats in threes and then falls silent before starting again somewhere else among the treetops. You track the movement of the flock by these calls, a map of sound spreading and contracting over the woodland, and you picture the birds wheeling in the grey sky, their wings flashing black and then transparent against the cloud. Nothing else stirs in that direction, no deer breaking cover, no plume of dust rising from the road, and you are grateful for the rooks, because listening to them is easier than listening to silence alone. The sun clears the horizon now, not as a visible disk, but as a sudden wash of pale gold that touches the upper edge of the mist and turns it into something luminous. The mist itself begins to rise in earnest, pulling free of the river in long scarves that wrap around the mill and then unravel. The shadow of the castle tower falls across the field at a steep angle, a shape of darkness that moves almost too slowly to perceive, and you watch its edge creep toward the hedgeline with the same quiet patience you would give to the hour hand of a clock. There is no hurry in the shadows this morning. They have all day to reach their marks. You realize with a small interior quiet that you have been standing in the same spot for what must be a long while, because the cramp in your lower back announces itself as a dull and familiar ache. You shift your weight from left foot to right, roll your shoulders once, and let the ache dissolve without complaint. Then you lift your hands from the stone and examine them, the gloves darkened with moisture and the leather soft as old book bindings. You flex your fingers one by one, feeling the joints crackle faintly, and then return your palms to the parapet where they were, finding the same impression they had left behind. Beyond the river, the sheep are tiny dots on the hillside, white against the green-brown of the winter pasture, and their slow grazing is a rhythm you can almost measure with your pulse. They move a step, lower their heads, tear grass, raise their heads, chew, move a step, and the pattern continues into the distance like a song with an infinite number of verses. There are no dogs with them, no shepherd visible, just the flock and the hill and the cloud that has begun to stretch across the sky from the north. A great grey wing of alto stratus that filters the sun into a softer, more diffuse light. With the softening of the light, the temperature drops a degree, and a small breeze stirs at last, lifting the damp hair at your temples and carrying the smell of wood smoke from the ward kitchen chimneys. You turn your head just enough to watch the thin column of smoke rise straight for 30 feet and then bend eastward, spreading into the sky like ink dropped into water. The smell is the smell of mornings you have known since childhood, the smell of oat porridge and crackling fat and the particular sharpness of green apple wood, and it makes the wall feel like a sort of home, albeit a home made of stone and vigilance. You check the bowstring again, running a gloved fingertip along its length to test for slackness, and find it still taut with just the right tension to sing a low note if plucked. You do not pluck it. The note would break the spell of the quiet, and you have no need to hear it. Instead, you trace the grain of the yew-bow with your eye, following the line of a knot that the bowyer had worked around, a dark whorl in the pale wood that looks like a fingerprint left by the tree itself. The bow has been with you for 3 years, shaped and kept and oiled, and it knows the wall as well as you do. Your mind turns to the other archers who will relieve you later, each of them still sleeping or just now waking in the barrack room, pulling on their own tunics in the same sequence you did. You picture the one who always knots his belt twice, and the one who hums without knowing it. And these small certainties are a comfort, because they suggest that the day will proceed as all the days before it have done, without interruption, without siege. You are not foolish enough to believe this completely, but you are also not required to believe anything. You are required only to stand and watch, which you continue to do as the morning mist finally burns away and the full landscape opens up before you, empty, patient, and utterly at peace. The daylight that had been only a suggestion when you first climbed the stair is now a full and settled presence, washing the wall walk in a pale gold that picks out every grain and flaw in the stone with an almost pedantic clarity. You turn your back to the sun so that your own shadow falls across the bow resting in the embrasure, which allows you to see the wood, not in silhouette, but in its true colors. The heartwood, a deep brown like old leather, and the sapwood a creamy white, the line between them undulating, as though drawn by a slow river. The yew has been polished by 3 years of handling, and the surface shines with a subdued gloss where your palms have worn away the outer fibers, leaving a patina that is part oil, part salt from your skin, and part the fine dust of the wall itself. You lift the bow from its resting place, feeling the familiar balance tilt into your hand as the grip settles into the hollow between thumb and forefinger. The weight is no more than you expect, a little less than a gallon of water, and your arm knows exactly the angle to hold it so that the strain does not gather in your wrist. You run the thumb of your free hand along the belly of the bow, the side that faces you when drawn, starting from the upper limb and moving down toward the grip, with the same even pressure you would use to smooth a fold of cloth. The surface is cool and slick with the remnants of last week's linseed rubbing, and there are no new cracks, no hairline fissures that might whisper of a coming failure. The grain lines run straight and uninterrupted for the length of the bow, tiny parallel streams of darker brown in the pale sapwood, each one a year of growth recorded by the tree that once stood on a Welsh hillside and drank the rain. You turn the bow over and inspect the back, the side that faces the target, where a single knot has been worked around by the bower with careful skill, the S-curves of the grain flowing around it like water around a pebble. You have looked at this knot 1,000 times, and each time you notice something slightly different. Today it reminds you of a closed eye, the concentric rings forming a lid, and a faint line that might be a lash. You press your thumbnail gently into the wood near the knot to test the hardness, and the yew resists with the quiet dignity of timber that has seasoned for a decade, first as a stave in the bowyer's rafters, and then as a living tool in your keeping. Satisfied, you let your thumb travel onward to the tip, where the horn knock is lashed with sinew that has darkened to amber, and the string loop sits snug in its groove. The hemp string itself demands your attention now, because the morning mist has left a fine dew on its fibers, and you can see tiny beads of moisture clinging to the twisted strands, each one catching the light like a minuscule bead of glass. You take the string between your fingers at the center serving, where a tight wrapping of extra hemp protects the part that receives the arrow knock, and you begin to roll it gently back and forth, feeling the slight give of the waxed fibers as they warm to your touch. The serving is still tight, not a single thread lifted, and the wax that permeates it has a faint tackiness that picks up the dust of the wall in tiny specks, which you brush away with the side of your hand. From the pouch on your belt, you take a small lump of beeswax, a nugget the size of a walnut that has been worked soft by many mornings like this one. It is the color of pale honey and smells of distant meadows, clover and something smoky from the beekeeper's smoker, a scent that rises as your body warmth begins to melt its surface. You hold the wax against the string near the upper limb and begin to draw the string through it with a slow, steady motion, pinching the wax between thumb and fingertip as the hemp passes through, coating each strand with a new layer of protection. The motion is so familiar that your mind does not have to direct it. Your fingers know the pace, the pressure, the exact point at which the string feels fully fed, and you can move an inch lower and begin again. As you work your way down the string, the rhythm becomes something that occupies a layer of your awareness separate from the part that watches the horizon. Your hands carry on with the waxing, while your eyes lift from the bow and rest once more on the fields below, where the sheep have moved a little farther up the hillside, and the river has lost its silver gleam under the spreading cloud. A cart has emerged on the road, a tiny wooden box with wheels that turn too slowly to see, pulled by a shape that might be a donkey or a small horse, and you observe its progress for a while until the waxing motion reaches the lower limb, and you must shift your grip to finish the last few inches near the bottom knock. The string complete, you drop the beeswax back into its pouch and draw the string through your bare fingers now, having pulled off your right glove and tucked it under your belt. The hemp runs smoothly with no rough spots, its new coating giving it a slight sheen that makes the twisted structure more visible. A spiral of 2 strands counter-twisted around each other in a pattern that has not changed since the first bowstring was made. You find a tiny kink near the bottom where the string had rested against the stone, and you massage it out with your thumb, working the kink back and forth until the fibers lie flat and true again. Then you hook the string over your thumb and give it a gentle pluck, not hard enough to twang, but just enough to feel the vibration travel up your hand, a low and almost inaudible hum that speaks of good tension. Now comes the part of the morning ritual that you could perform in the dark, and sometimes have: the counting of the arrows. You slide the quiver off the parapet and set it across your knees as you settle onto the worn wooden stool that someone long ago placed in the corner of the wall walk, its legs uneven on the stone so that it rocks slightly, until you find the angle that holds it still. The quiver is a simple linen bag, stiffened with leather at the mouth, and its strap has left a groove in the leather where the weight has pulled it over countless watches. You loosen the drawstring and let the arrows rise a little, their grey goose feathers rustling against one another with a soft sound like dry grass in a breeze. You draw the first arrow free and hold it up against the sky, turning it between your fingers as you examine the nock, a small slot cut into the birch shaft and reinforced with a strip of horn. The nock is clean and unchipped, the horn insert still glued fast with no sign of drying or crack. The fletching comes next, 3 grey goose feathers bound at the base and tipped with fine linen thread that has been coated in a thin blue, now turned clear and hard. You run your thumb up the edge of each feather, feeling the barbs spring back into place after your touch, and you find them all intact with only the normal ruffling that comes from being drawn from the quiver and pushed against its neighbours. The shaft itself is straight, a wand of birch that has been hand-planed to a smooth cylinder, and when you close one eye and sight down it against the line of the parapet, there is no warp, no bend, nothing but a true line from nock to pile. The arrowhead glints dully in the daylight, a simple bodkin point of forged iron, with a squared tang driven into the shaft and secured with a ferrule. You check the ferrule for tightness, giving it a gentle twist with your fingers, and it does not move. There is a tiny spot of rust near the tip, an orange freckle no bigger than a poppy seed, and you polish it away with the cuff of your sleeve, the wool scratching softly against the metal. Satisfied, you return the arrow to the quiver and draw the next one, beginning the same sequence of inspection: nock, fletching, shaft, head, and then back again. The repetition of the task does not bore you, because boredom implies a desire for something else, and on this wall there is nothing else to desire. The counting and checking is a form of stillness, a practice that fills the minutes without disturbing the quiet, and by the time you have inspected 3 arrows the world has narrowed to the space between your hands and the grey feathers and the smell of birch and old iron. You notice as you draw the 5th arrow that one of its feathers has a kink near the tip, where the barb has been bent sharply backward, and you pause to moisten your fingertip and smooth it back into alignment, the feather remembering its shape with a gentle creak. The linen thread at that same arrow's base has a single loose end, a stray fibre no longer than a grain of barley, and you pinch it off with your nails and let the fragment drift away over the inner edge of the wall, watching it spin down into the ward until it disappears against the grey cobbles. By the time you have inspected all 24 arrows, the light has shifted enough that the shadow of the merlin beside you has retreated a handspan across the stone. You slide the arrows back into the quiver, one by one, hearing the soft hollow sound of shafts settling together and the muffled thump as the pile points touch the bottom. You draw the string tight and tie it with the same knot you have tied since you were a boy learning the bow in a field behind your village, a knot that never slips but always releases with a single pull, and then you set the quiver back against the embrasure where it can be reached in a single motion if the need ever arises. The routine of checking the equipment has left your mind in a state that is not quite sleep, but not quite waking either, a place where thoughts drift without edges, and the sensations of the present moment take on a heightened clarity. You notice the grain of the stone under the stool's legs, the particular way the lichen on the inner wall has grown in a shape that could be a map of an unknown coast, the distant clink from the blacksmith's hammer that now strikes a slower rhythm than it did at dawn, because the smith has moved on to work that requires more thought and less force. You notice your own breathing, which has fallen into a pattern matching the slow blink of the light through the cloud, and you let it continue without interference. A gentle tide that moves your chest just enough to stir the fibers of your tunic. The bow still rests across your lap, and you lift it once more, not to check anything but simply to feel it. The yew has grown so familiar that holding it is like holding your own hand, and you trace the curves of the grip with your fingertips, the subtle hollow where your thumb sits and the slight bulge where the palm presses. there is a small patch of darker wood on the belly where a drop of moisture must have once seeped under the oil, a stain, the shape of a bean, and you've come to think of it as the bow's signature, the mark that distinguishes it from every other bow in the rack downstairs. You buff it gently with the wool of your sleeve, though it is not needed buffing for years. The sounds of the castle continue their slow evolution around you, and now you can hear the rhythm of the well bucket rising again, the chain rattling link by link as someone draws water for the midday meal, and then the slosh of water into a pail and the footsteps retreating into the kitchen. A pigeon lands on the merlon to your right with a soft whir of wings, settles its feathers with a shiver, and regards you with one orange eye for the space of a breath, before launching itself out over the wall and down into the fields. You follow its flight until it becomes a speck, and then nothing, and your gaze returns naturally to the bough across your knees, as if drawn there by mild gravity. You think, without urgency, about the tree that gave this wood. It would have grown on high ground, where the soil was thin and the wind constant, forcing the fibers to tighten and the grain to compress into the dense, resilient stuff that makes a war bough worth carrying. The tree had stood for perhaps a century before the boyar's axe found it, and in that century it had sheltered birds and soaked up sun and shed its needles into a soft carpet beneath, a slow and patient existence that mirrors your own weight on this wall in a way that feels pleasingly circular. You do not pursue the thought any further, you simply let it rest, a smooth pebble in the stream of your awareness. The cool air moves more freely now, and you pull your glove back on, working your fingers into the stiff leather until each digit finds its proper place. The glove smells of the tallow you used to waterproof it last winter, a faint scent that mingles with the beeswax on your fingertips and the clean mineral smell of the stone. You stand up from the stool, feeling the blood return to your lower legs in a warm, pricking rush, and you lean the bow back into its spot within the embrasure with the same care you would use to lay a sleeping child down. The quiver you adjust so that the strap lies exactly where it was before, and then you place both palms on the cold, rough stone of the parapet and let your gaze sweep once more across the horizon, finding nothing that was not there before and nothing missing that was there before. In the quiet that follows, you become aware of a small pressure at your temple, where the edge of your hood has been rubbing, and you reach up to adjust the hood, putting it a fraction forward so that the wool cups your ear, and the pressure moreward so that the wool cups your ear and the pressure moves to a different spot. This small act of comfort sends a ripple of relaxation through your shoulders and down your spine, and you settle back into the posture of watching with the ease of long practice. The bow and the string and the arrows are ready, which means that for now there is nothing more to do but stand in the company of old wood and old stone, and let the day pass in its slow, unremarkable way. The sun continues its shallow climb behind the cloud, and your shadow on the wall walk stretches a little farther east, thinning at the edges until it looks like a charcoal drawing of a sentinel. You watch the shadow the way you might watch the slow shadow of a sundial, without expectation, and the morning moves into its middle hours with no more fuss than a page turning in a book you are reading very slowly, a book whose story is the story of light on a wall, and the feel of you under a hand, and the sound of wind threading through the arrow loops, low and constant and as soothing as the hum of bees in a lime tree long ago. With the bow resting against the merlon and the first hours of the watch already settling into the familiar ache behind your knees, you turn your full attention outward. The mist has burned away completely now, leaving the air scrubbed clean and faintly sharp, like the smell of well water on a winter morning. You let your gaze travel across the landscape below, not scanning for threats, but simply receiving what the land offers. A wide and quiet picture that has not changed in any important way since you last looked, or since your grandfather's grandfather first cleared these fields. The countryside spreads before you as a patchwork of autumn strips, each one a different shade of brown and gold, depending on what grew there last and what the plough has done since. The nearest field is a pale stubble of harvested barley, the cut stalks leaning in uneven rows that catch the low sun and turn it into a dull gleam, like 1,000 tiny spear shafts laid to rest. Beyond that lies a strip of fallow land where the soil has been turned in broad furrows, the ridges casting shadows that deepen the color to a rich, dark umber, and the troughs holding a faint glint of leftover moisture from the night's mist. Farther still, a third strip carries the faded yellow-green of late turnip tops, their leaves spread flat and patient, waiting for the first hard frost to sweeten the roots below. These strips are divided by low stone walls that from your height look like faint pencil lines drawn by a careful hand, running straight for a while before kinking slightly to follow an older boundary long forgotten. The walls are made of the same grey limestone as the castle, cleared from the fields centuries ago and stacked without mortar, each stone resting on its neighbour by weight and habit. In places the walls have sagged, a small landslide of pebbles at the base where a fox or a badger has pushed through, but mostly they hold their line with the quiet stubbornness of things that were built before memory. You trace one wall with your eye from the corner of the barley field all the way to the river, watching it cross a patch of rough grazing where a single hawthorn tree leans sideways, its bare branches making a dark scribble against the pale sky. The river itself makes a slow silver bend between the alder trees that line its banks, their trunks straight and grey as columns holding up a roof of bare twigs. The water is low in this season, exposing shelves of gravel on the inner curve of the meander, and the current moves with a glassy slowness that only reveals itself when a drifting leaf catches the light and spins once before continuing downstream, where the sun strikes the surface directly. The river becomes a mirror of hammered metal, too bright to look at for long, and where the alders cast their shadow, it turns a deep green-brown, the colour of old bronze. A fallen log juts from the near bank, its bark long stripped away to show smooth, pale wood, and a single moorhen picks its way along the trunk with the exaggerated care of a tightrope walker, dipping its beak into the water at intervals too small to see. Just beyond the river's bend, the watermill sits still, a squat cube of grey stone with a roof of mossy thatch that has faded over the years to the colour of a field mouse's back. The wheel is motionless, its wooden paddings dark with water stains, and its axle greased with a smear of tallow that glistens faintly in the sun. No smoke rises from the miller's chimney, and the sluice gate that feeds the mill race is closed, holding back a pool of still water that reflects the building upside down with a slight wobble whenever a ripple disturbs it. You have seen the wheel turn on other days, the slow creak of its revolutions, and the splash of water dropping from the buckets. But today it rests, and the silence that reaches you from that quarter is the silence of a tool put by. From the mill, your gaze follows the road as it emerges from the cluster of buildings and begins its climb toward the east, a pale gash of dried mud and packed chalk that cuts across the open ground in a line so straight it must have been a Roman track before the castle was ever thought of. The surface is rutted where carts have passed in wetter weather, the ruts now hardened into iron ridges that will jar the wheels of any wagon that uses them. Along the verges, the grass has been cropped short by sheep, and here and there a patch of dandelion still shows a last yellow flower, a small defiant sun against the general brown. The road climbs gently for half a mile, passing between two low hillocks that you could cup in your palm if you reached out, and then it disappears into the dark mouth of the woodland that fringes the eastern horizon. The woodland itself is a band of oak and ash and occasional beech, their bare winter crowns interlacing like the threads of a woven basket. From this distance, the trees lose their individuality and become a single texture, a rough brownish-grey mass that holds the shadow of the cloud within it. The cloud that covered the sun earlier has stretched across a wider arc of sky, thinning at its edges to a soft white gauze and thickening at its center to a deeper grey that promises no rain, but simply a quiet dimming of the afternoon. The light that filters through it is even and directionless, softening the outlines of everything until the landscape looks like a painting on old linen, the colors muted and the details slightly blurred. You notice a flock of sheep grazing on a distant hill that rises to the north of the wood, their shapes tiny and patient against the green-brown of the winter pasture. They move with the slow rhythm of a tide, shifting a few steps, lowering their heads to tear at the grass, raising them again to chew with a sideways motion of the jaw, then stepping forward once more into the next patch of untouched grazing. Their fleeces are the grey-white of unwashed wool, and against the dull hill they look like a scattering of small stones that have somehow learned to walk. There is no shepherd visible, no dog working the edges of the flock, only the sheep themselves and the hill that holds them. You watch their steady progress for a long while, measuring the near imperceptible shift of the whole flock across the slope, and the watching empties your mind as surely as the sheep empty the hill of its grass. The sound of the rooks rises again from the wood, the same cawing arguments you heard earlier, but now further away as the birds move deeper into the trees. Their calls reach you as a series of rough notes, a chiding caw repeated in threes and then fading, starting again somewhere else among the treetops, a sound map that marks the invisible movement of the flock. You track them without effort, your ears doing the work while your eyes rest on the sheep, and for a moment the two distant activities, birds arguing and sheep grazing, weave together into a single fabric of quiet life going on below the wall. A cart appears on the road, the first human movement you have seen since the fox at dawn. It comes from the direction of the village, drawn by a single horse whose head nods with each slow step, and the driver sits hunched on the seat with the reins loose in one hand. The cart carries a load of something covered with a grey cloth, perhaps turnips or sacks of flour, and it jolts over the frozen ruts with a series of small hesitations that you can imagine as a sound, even if the distance swallows it. You watch the cart travel along the straight stretch, pass between the two hillocks, and disappear into the woodland shadow without any change of pace, as unhurried as the day itself. The road returns to emptiness behind it, and after a moment you cannot be sure the cart was ever there at all. The stone of the parapet under your forearms has begun to hold a faint warmth from the sun that now filters through the thinner edge of the cloud, and you shift your weight slightly to bring a new patch of the cold stone into contact with your sleeves. The motion is automatic, something your body decides before your mind notices, and you settle again into the posture of watching with the same ease that the river settles into its bed. You are not waiting for anything in particular. Waiting implies an expectation, a looking forward, and what you are doing is closer to inhabiting, letting the view fill you until there is no gap between the watcher and the watch. The shadows that fall across the fields have changed their angle since you first noticed them, the great triangle of shade cast by the castle tower having crept across the barley stubble far enough to touch the first low stone wall. A hawk lifts from a copse beyond the river, rising on a thermal that must be just warm enough to carry it, and you follow its slow spiral upward. The wings spread wide and motionless, except for a tiny adjustment of the primary feathers at the tips. The hawk circles 3 times, 4 times, and then slides sideways off the pillar of warm air to glide away northward, diminishing to a speck and then to nothing. The sky where it was is empty again, a pale grey wash with the faintest hint of blue behind it. The air on the wall has turned cool enough that your breath makes a small ghost in front of your lips, visible for half a second before it vanishes, and you pull the collar of your hood a little closer around your chin. The wool smells of lanolin and wood smoke, the same scent it has carried for months, and the familiarity of it is a comfort that sits in the back of your mind like a cat settling into a fireside chair. You are aware now of the small sounds that your own body makes, the slight creak of your belt when you shift, the soft rasp of wool against the stone when you lean forward. And these sounds join the general quiet as naturally as the rook's cawing and the sheep's silence. The afternoon deepens by degrees, each degree measured in a subtle shift of light or a slight cooling of the air rather than any dramatic event. The cloud thickens enough to hide the sun's position entirely, turning the sky into a dome of even grey that presses down on the land with a gentle weight, muffling the already muffled sounds into something close to silence. The river loses its silver gleam and becomes a flat band of slate, the alders along its bank darker now and more distinct, their trunks standing out like charcoal lines against the pale grass. Even the sheep on the distant hill seem to slow, their grazing intervals lengthening, until each movement takes a full breath to complete. You let your eyes rest on the watermill again, noticing a detail that had escaped you before, a small wooden door set into the upper floor, painted a faded blue that must once have been as bright as a summer sky, but is now the color of old milk. A rope hangs from the pulley above the door, its end swinging faintly in a breeze that has begun to stir from the north, and the swinging is so slow and regular that it feels like the pulse of the building itself, a quiet metronome counting out the hour. You watch the rope for a while, then let your gaze drift back to the road and the empty fields and the wood that holds the far horizon in its tangled branches. Nothing has changed, and nothing will change before the light begins its slow decline. You know this with the same certainty that you know the weight of the bow in your hand, and the knowing is not boring, but deeply restful, a kind of peace that settles into the spaces between your thoughts. The autumn fields below you continue to hold their stillness. The stone walls continue to mark their ancient boundaries, and the river continues its slow meander toward a sea you will never see. You stand above it all, a part of the picture that you observe, and you breathe in the cool afternoon air that tastes of wet earth and distant wood smoke, and the faint, clean tang of the coming evening. The world beyond the wall has grown so quiet that the sounds within the castle begin to rise and carry, not as interruptions, but as a deep and steady music that has been playing all along beneath your noticing. You shift your weight slightly, turning one ear away from the open fields and toward the inner ward, and you let the layers of sound build around you like the slow filling of a cistern from some underground spring. The wall itself conducts these noises, the stone carrying the vibration of every movement below and delivering it to your feet through the soles of your boots, a faint hum that is more felt than heard. The first sound that separates itself from the general quiet is the blacksmith's hammer striking the anvil in the far corner of the lower ward, a steady sequence of notes that rings out clearly and then fades into the stone. The smith has been working since before dawn, but the character of his hammering has changed as the morning has progressed. The heavy, urgent blows that shaped the rough iron are done, and now he is tapping with a lighter hand, working on something that requires precision rather than force. The hammer falls in a rhythm of 3 quick strikes and a pause, 3 quick strikes and a pause, and in the pause you can hear the ring of the anvil still vibrating, a high, clear tone that hangs in the air for a breath before the next set of strikes. The sound is so regular that your own heartbeat seems to want to match it, slowing to the pace of the smith's careful work. Between the hammer strikes, other sounds from the smithy reach you in fragments, the hiss of the bellows drawing air, the dull clang of tongs being set down on the stone bench, and once the sharp, brief scream of hot iron plunged into the quenching trough, followed by a cloud of steam that you cannot see from this angle but can imagine as a white puff rising against the dark interior of the forge. The smell that accompanies these sounds drifts up in thin ribbons, a sharp metallic tang mixed with the charcoal smoke of the fire, and it mingles with the cleaner air on the war walk, until you could identify that smithy blindfolded in any castle in the land. Closer to the wall, directly below the parapet where you stand, the kitchen yard has begun its own daily rhythm. You hear the scullery door open with the groan of its iron hinges, a sound as familiar as your own breathing, and then the shuffle of feet on the damp cobbles as the kitchen boys make their first trips to the well. The cobbles in that part of the ward are worn smooth by generations of hurried footsteps, and the sound they make under the boys' wooden clogs is a wet, hollow scuff that echoes against the inner curtain wall and then dies away. The well itself creaks in its wooden frame as the bucket is lowered, the chain paying out link by link with a thin metallic rattle that speeds up slightly as the bucket gathers momentum and then stops abruptly when it strikes the water far below. There follows a splash that echoes up through the stone shaft, a sound that is not a single note but a small cloud of notes, the water disturbed and sloshing against the sides of the bucket, and then a pause while the bucket fills and grows heavy. The chain begins its upward journey with a deeper clink, the links now bearing weight and grinding slightly against the iron rim of the windlass, and you can hear the breath of the boy turning the handle, a steady huff of effort that keeps time with the turning. When the bucket reaches the top, there is a slosh of water poured into a waiting pail, the wooden staves of the pail giving a soft wet creak as they swell, and then the footsteps retreat toward the kitchen, carrying the weight of the water across the cobbles with a slower and more deliberate tread. The kitchen itself is a low stone building with a slate roof that juts out from the inner wall, and its chimney is a constant presence in the corner of your eye, sending up a column of grey smoke that leans with the breeze. From within the kitchen comes a murmur of voices, the words indistinct but the tones clear enough, the cook's deeper voice giving instructions, the lighter replies of the scullions, and sometimes a short laugh that rises and falls without consequence. Pots and kettles shift on their hooks with a dull iron clang, a wooden spoon scrapes against the inside of a cauldron, and at one point a basket of something, perhaps onions or turnips, is upended onto a wooden table with a series of rolling thumps, followed by the scatter of dry skins. A dog gives a single low bark somewhere near the kitchen door, and then another sound follows that you recognize as the creature settling back onto the flagstones, a heavy exhale and the soft thump of its body relaxing against the stone. The dog, you know without looking, is a large brindled hound that belongs to the castle's master of the hunt and spends most days sleeping in the warmest patch of the kitchen yard, moving only to follow the sun as it crosses the sky. It will lie there until the afternoon, when the cook will throw it a bone or a bit of gristle, and then it will stretch and turn and settle again. A creature whose life consists almost entirely of waiting and resting. From the gatehouse, which lies to the left of the kitchen complex and forms the main entrance to the castle, the sound of voices carries more distinctly because the gatehouse arch acts as a funnel for sound, gathering it and projecting it upward into the ward. The guards there are changing shifts, and you can hear the exchange of the password, the words too soft to catch, but the cadence of the call and response as regular as a liturgy. The departing guards stamp their feet on the flagstones, partly from the cold and partly to restore the circulation in their legs, and the sound is a rapid patter that you feel through the stone as a faint tapping like rain on a distant roof. The new guards take their positions with the heavy tread of men who have just eaten their morning meal and are settling into the long hours of standing still, and you hear the shift of their mail hauberks as they adjust their shoulders, a sound like 1,000 tiny iron insects rustling all at once. One of them coughs, a dry sound that echoes under the gatehouse arch, and another says something that provokes a low chuckle, and then the silence of duty reclaims them, and their voices blend back into the general hum of the castle. Waking. Above the gatehouse, in the square tower that rises 3 stories to a crenellated top, the Lord's household is beginning its own morning routines. You can hear the faint shuffle of a servant sweeping the floor of the great hall, the bristles of the broom making a regular swish and pause as the rushes are swept toward the central hearth for renewal. The old rushes are gathered into a basket, their dry rustle a sound like wind through autumn leaves, and the new rushes are scattered with a softer, lighter sound. A whisper of straw falling onto the flagstones. From the solar on the 2nd floor, where the Lord and his lady sleep, there comes the sound of a shutter being opened, its wooden frame scraping against the stone embrasure, and the creak of the iron latch as it is hooked back to let in the morning air. The chapel bell rings now, a single clear note that hangs in the air for a long moment before fading into the stonework. It is the call to morning mass, not the great peal that would summon the whole garrison, but the small handbell rung by the chaplain's boy as he walks from the chapel door to the corner of the ward and back. The note is high and sweet, the kind of sound that seems to clean the air as it passes through it, and for a moment all the other sounds of the castle seem to pause and listen. Then the bell falls silent, and the general hum resumes, the wood and iron and voices rising again, like water returning to a channel from which it had been briefly diverted. You hear footsteps in the stairwell now, the same spiral steps you climbed before dawn, and they are light and quick, not the heavy tread of a soldier, but the rapid patter of a child or a small servant. The footsteps pass below you and continue up, emerging onto the wall walk 2 embrasures down from where you stand, and you see that it is the baker's boy, carrying a tray of small loaves wrapped in a cloth for the guards on the morning shift. He pauses at each post, exchanges a few words too soft to hear, and then moves on, his feet sure on the narrow walk despite the height. When he reaches you, he nods and offers the tray, and you take one of the loaves, still warm from the oven, its crust dusted with a fine flour that clings to your glove. The boy says something about the weather holding, you reply something about the cold, and then he is gone, his footsteps receding along the wall and then descending into another stairwell that will take him down into the ward once more. The bread is soft in your hand, and you hold it for a moment, feeling the warmth seep through the leather of your glove. The smell is the smell of fresh bread, yeast and wheat, and the faint tang of the sourdough starter that the baker has kept alive in his wooden trough for longer than anyone can remember. You will eat it later, when the sun reaches its zenith and the other archers begin their slow progress up the stair to relieve you, but for now you simply hold it and let its warmth be another small comfort among the many that the castle provides. Below you, in the stables that line the west wall of the lower ward, the horses are stirring. You can hear the thump of a hoof against a wooden stall, a single dull knock that carries no impatience, only the weight of a large animal shifting its stance. Straw rustles as the horses move, and there is the low whicker of one greeting another, a soft sound that vibrates in the throat and does not rise above the level of the cobbles. The stable lads are forking hay into the mangers, and the fork tines scrape against the stone floor with a gritting sound, and the hay itself falls with a dry swish that is half sound and half smell, the scent of dried meadow grass floating up and mixing with the other odours of the ward. In the carpentry shop next to the stables, the carpenter has begun planing a beam for some repair that the castle requires, and the sound of the plane is a long, steady hiss, followed by a pause as he draws it back, then another long hiss as he pushes forward. The shavings curl up around his feet with a soft crackling sound, and every now and then he stops to test the smoothness of the wood with his thumb, a pause that you cannot hear but can sense in the rhythm of the work. The smell of fresh-cut oak drifts up from the workshop, a clean, sharp scent that cuts through the heavier smells of the kitchen and smithy, and it reminds you of the bowyer's shop in the village where you grew up, a small dark room full of yew staves and the sweet dust of sanded wood. The sounds of the castle continue to layer and interweave as the morning progresses, each one individual, but none loud enough to dominate. The blacksmith pauses in his hammering, and in the sudden quiet you can hear the carpenter's plane and the stable lads' voices and the distant murmur of the kitchen all the more clearly, before the hammer resumes with a different rhythm, a slower and heavier beat that means he has moved on to another task. The well bucket descends again, the scullery door opens and closes twice, and somewhere in the barracks a man coughs in his sleep, a single hollow sound that rises and falls without consequence. You notice how the sounds change as they travel upward, the stone walls of the ward filtering and softening them, until what reaches you on the wall walk is not the raw noise of work, but a gentle composite, a wash of activity that requires no attention and no response. It is like listening to a conversation in a neighboring room while you drift towards sleep, the individual words fading into a rhythm of voices that carries meaning only in its cadence. You let this wash of sound flow around you without trying to pick out any single thread, and in the letting go you find that the waiting becomes lighter, the hours less distinct, the boundary between yourself and the castle less clear. The wind, which has been barely noticeable all morning, shifts now and carries the sound of the chapel bell again, though the bell itself has not rung. It is an echo caught between the walls and released by the change in air, a phantom sound that fades as soon as you notice it, and you are left with the steady pulse of the castle's life continuing below. A seagull cries somewhere high above, drawn inland from the distant coast by the smell of the kitchen middens, and its call is a wild, lonely sound that belongs more to the open sea than to the enclosed ward, a reminder of the wider world beyond the walls that continues to turn without any need for your attention. You shift your position on the wall walk, moving a few paces to the left to a spot where the sun has been pooling against the inner merlon, and you lean back against the warm stone, letting its stored heat seep through your tunic into your shoulder blades. From this new position, the sounds of the ward arrange themselves differently, the carpenter now louder and the kitchen fainter, the smithy a steady presence in the background rather than a foreground detail. You close your eyes for the space of a breath, not from tiredness, but from a desire to hear without seeing, to let the castle's morning music fill your ears without the distraction of the light. The sounds are the sounds of a place at peace, a community going about its daily tasks without urgency or alarm, and they are as soothing as any lullaby sung in a dark room to a child who cannot yet name the world. When you open your eyes again, the light has shifted only by a degree, and the sounds continue as before, the same complex and gentle harmony of work and rest and waiting. You settle deeper into your own stillness, your bow a companion at your side, your bread a small weight in your hand, and you let the castle hold you within its walls of sound, as surely as it holds you within its walls of stone. The morning will pass into afternoon. The shift will change, and the sounds will alter slightly, the hammer pausing for the midday meal, and the kitchen growing louder, and then quiet again. But for now, there is only this steady, calming wash of life below the wall, and you are a part of it, hearing and heard, a note among notes in the long, slow song of the castle's day. The sun climbs high enough now that its light falls directly onto the outer edge of the wall walk, a pale winter sun that carries no real heat, but still paints a band of warmth across the stone, where the merlons cast no shadow. You feel that warmth on your neck when you turn your face from the wind, a slight lessening of the cold that convinces you it is time to rest your legs and take the midday meal. The castle below has fallen into its own rhythm of eating, the kitchen having gone quiet after the flurry of the morning baking, and the sound of a single spoon scraping the bottom of a kettle reaches you as a faint, lonely note. You choose a corner of the parapet where two walls meet at a right angle, a sheltered spot that has collected a small drift of dust and dried moss in the crevice. The stone here is darker, having never been touched by the sun, and it holds the chill of the night. But if you crouch with your back against the warmer outer merlon and your feet tucked under you, the arrangement is comfortable enough. You lower yourself slowly, your knees creaking with the same soft complaint that a tree branch makes when bent, and you settle into a crouch that lets your shoulders rest against the rough limestone blocks. The bow you place carefully beside you with the string facing up, and the quiver you lean against the inner wall, where it will not roll. From inside your tunic, you draw out the cloth bundle that has been resting against your ribs all morning, warmed by your body into a soft and pliable package. The cloth itself is a square of coarse linen, undyed and frayed a little at the edges, washed so many times that it has become as soft as old skin. You spread it across your knees with the care of someone laying out a picnic on a hillside, smoothing the wrinkles with your palm and watching how the crumbs from yesterday's meal still cling to the fibers in a faint scatter of pale dots. The smell of the linen is the smell of bread and cheese, and the inside of your tunic, a homely blend that has accompanied you on 100 watches. Inside the cloth are the 3 items you packed before dawn, while the barracks were still dark and the other archers slept. You lift out the heel of dark bread first, turning it in your fingers to examine its surface in the new light. The loaf was baked 3 days ago, and the crust has gone from crackling crisp to a chewy, leathery firmness that yields slightly when pressed. The outside is dusted with the fine grey powder of the stone oven, and the cut side, where you tore it from the larger loaf, shows the interior crumb in all its dense complexity. A tight structure of tiny holes, each one a bubble that rose and set during the baking, the colour of old oak and rich earth. You hold the bread under your nose for a moment, and the scent is sour and nutty, with the faint ghost of the rye fields that grew the grain. The wedge of cheese comes next, and it is the last remnant of a wheel that has been aging in the undercroft since the summer before last. The cheese is hard and pale, the colour of a winter moon, with a faint grain of salt crystallized on its surface in patches that catch the light like a sprinkling of coarse sand. The rind on one edge is darker, almost grey, where it sat against the wooden shelf, and you run your thumbnail along it, feeling the waxy texture that the aging has given it. When you press the cheese against the bread, it leaves no dent. Only the promise of the sharp, clean taste that will fill your mouth when you finally take a bite. The smell of the cheese is mild and creamy, a scent that seems to belong to a colder season than this one. The small leather bottle of water is last, its sides bulging slightly from the pressure of the liquid inside, and the stopper a tight plug of carved oak that has been polished by your fingers until it shines. You shake the bottle gently, and the water inside makes a soft, glugging sound, a sound that reminds you of the river behind the mill, and you set the bottle beside your knee where it will be easy to reach when the cheese leaves your mouth dry. The leather is stained dark from years of holding water and wine in turn, and the seam along its side is stitched with a fine sinew that has never leaked, a testament to the saddler who made it. You begin to eat, not from hunger exactly, but from the recognition of the time for eating has come. A quiet hour marked by the sun's position and the silence of the ward below. You break a corner from the bread, using your thumbs to pull the crust apart along the line of a crack, and the bread gives way with a small dry tear. The piece is no bigger than a walnut, and you place it on your tongue without hurry, letting it sit there while the moisture from your mouth begins to soften its edges. The taste is slow to arrive, first the faint sourness of the long fermentation, then the deeper, earthier flavour of the rye, and finally a sweetness that only reveals itself after the bread has been chewed for a long time. You chew slowly, counting the chews not with numbers, but with the rhythm of your jaw, a steady grinding that sends small waves of sound through your skull, muffled and intimate. While the bread softens, you use your free hand to break a small shaving from the wedge of cheese, pressing the edge with your thumbnail until a thin curl of pale yellow detaches itself. The cheese is so hard that it fractures rather than cuts, leaving a surface that glitters with the crystalline salt grains. You place this shaving on your tongue alongside the bread, and the two textures combine in a way that is perfectly familiar. The soft, soggy crumb and the sharp, grainy cheese melting together into a paste that you move from cheek to cheek. The salt first stings slightly, then fades, leaving behind a creamy, nutty flavor that lingers long after you have swallowed. You eat in this manner for some time, breaking off small pieces, chewing them thoroughly, pausing between bites to watch the sky or the fields, or the slow drift of the cloud that has now covered half the visible sky. The act of eating becomes a kind of meditation, each bite a small world of sensation that occupies your mind completely for as long as it lasts, and then empties it again to make room for the next. The bread and the cheese seem to last longer than they ought, as if the quietness of the war walk stretches both time and food into something more generous. A sparrow lands a few paces away, its small brown body appearing on the stone as suddenly as a dropped leaf. It tilts its head to one side, fixing you with a round black eye that reflects the grey sky in a tiny convex mirror, and it hops once, twice, closer, its claws making a minute scratching sound on the limestone. You freeze without consciously deciding to, the way a shadow freezes when the sun goes behind a cloud, and you watch the bird with the same quiet attention that you gave the river and the fields. The sparrow's feathers are a complex pattern of browns and greys, each one edged with a paler fringe that gives it a soft, indistinct outline, and its beak is the color of dried straw, slightly open as if panting from the effort of its short flight. You let a crumb fall from your fingers, a morsel of bread no bigger than a flax seed, and the sparrow hops toward it with a rapid mechanical motion, pecking at the stone with a tiny click. The crumb disappears into its beak, and the bird tilts its head at you again, waiting. You drop another crumb and another, each one landing softly and rolling a fraction before coming to rest, and the sparrow gathers them with a neat efficiency, never moving more than a few inches from where it started. Its trust, if trust it is, feels like a small gift on this long, still afternoon, and you hold your breath without knowing it, unwilling to break the spell. The sparrow eventually flutters off, departing as suddenly as it arrived, its wings carrying it out over the wall and down into the ward where the kitchen scraps will provide a more substantial meal. You watch it go, a tiny shape falling and rising on the air currents, until it merges with the grey stone below and becomes invisible. The stone where it stood holds no trace of its visit except a faint dust of breadcrumbs and a tiny white dropping that will wash away with the next rain. You let out the breath you were holding and the air leaves your lungs in a long, slow stream that fogs briefly and then vanishes. Now you take up the leather bottle and work the stopper free with a twist and a pull, the oak giving a soft pop as it releases from the neck. The water inside is cool from having rested against your body through the cold morning, and you raise the bottle to your lips, letting a small amount flow into your mouth. The taste is the taste of the well, clean and faintly mineral, with a slight iron tang from the bucket and the chain. You hold the water in your mouth for a moment, letting it wash the last crumbs of bread and cheese from your teeth, and then you swallow, feeling the coolness travel down your throat and spread into your chest. You take another sip, smaller this time, and then replace the stopper, pressing it firmly back into the neck until it seats with a soft thud. The leather bottle goes back beside your knee, and you sit for a while in the afterglow of eating, your stomach gently full without being heavy, your hands resting on the cloth that still covers your knees. The cloth holds a few remaining crumbs and a smear of cheese oil that will wash out in the next laundry, and you gather the corners together, folding the linen into a neat square that you tuck back inside your tunic, next to your ribs where it rode before. You wipe your hands on the front of your tunic, rubbing the fingers against the rough wool until they feel dry and clean, and then you stretch your legs out in front of you, pointing your toes toward the inner edge of the wall walk. The muscles in your calves protest slightly, then relax, and a pleasant ache spreads upward through your thighs. The kind of ache that comes from stillness rather than motion. You let your head fall back against the stone, and the sky above is a pale grey dome that seems to press down with a gentle weight, holding you in place. The moment of rest stretches on, and you become aware of the small details of your own body, the pulse in your wrists beating against the cuffs of your gloves, the slight chafe of the tunic at the back of your neck, the warmth of the sun on the left side of your face where it peaks between two merlons. Your thoughts drift without direction, touching on the taste of the cheese, the sparrow's tilted head, the way the bread crumbed under your thumbs, and then drifting away again into a soft, featureless space where there are no thoughts at all. You think of the long afternoon ahead, the hours of watching that will be no different from the hours of watching that have already passed, and the thought is not a burden, but a comfort. The fields below are still empty, the road still a pale line across the land, and the river still makes its slow bend between the alders, the watermill still motionless with its wheel dark against the stone. Nothing has changed, and nothing is expected to change, and so you allow yourself to sit a little longer, the stone at your back, and the sky above, and the quiet all around. After a while, you begin to notice the cold creeping back into your fingers, where the gloves have worn thin, and you know it is time to stand and resume your watch with fresh eyes. You gather your legs under you, pressing one palm against the stone for balance, and rise with the same slow deliberation that you used to crouch. The bow is lifted from its resting place and returned to the embrasure. The quiver is adjusted on its strap, and you settle your weight onto both feet, feeling the solid stone beneath you as if it were the deck of a ship anchored in a calm harbor. You take a last look at the cloth bundle, which now forms a small, warm lump inside your tunic, and you think of the woman who wove the linen, the man who baked the bread, the dairymaid who pressed the cheese, the saddler who stitched the bottle, and all the other hands that have touched these simple objects before they reached you. That thought, too, is a quiet one. Not a list, but a gentle awareness of the web of effort that holds you up on this wall, a web as strong and as invisible as the wind that now moves through the arrow loops with a low and constant hum. You turn your eyes to the horizon once more, the same horizon you have watched all morning, and it greets you like an old friend who has been waiting patiently for your return. The light is beginning to shift toward amber, though the evening is still hours away and the shadows on the fields have grown long and soft, reaching eastward across the stubble like dark water flowing in slow motion. You settle your shoulders against the crenellation and let your gaze stretch outward, your stomach fed and your body rested, ready to watch the long afternoon unspool itself across the quiet land. The sun has begun its slow slide from the zenith, a movement so gradual that you cannot see it happening, but can measure it in the way your shadow now stretches a handspan farther across the stone than it did when you ate. The warmth that had pooled in the corner of the parapet has thinned and cooled, and you have returned to your post at the embrasure, your bow resting against the merlon, and your eyes moving across the familiar fields with the same patient rhythm that a weaver moves a shuttle. The afternoon has settled into its long middle, that stretch of the day when time seems to thicken like honey cooling in a jar. It is in this hour that you hear the footsteps on the stair, a sound that rises through the stone before it reaches your ears, a vibration in the soles of your boots that tells you someone is climbing. The footsteps are heavy and measured, the tread of a man who knows these stairs as well as you do and is in no hurry to reach the top. You do not turn because there is no need to turn. The sound alone tells you who is coming, and you wait with the same quiet calm that you have maintained all day. The wooden door at the head of the stair swings open with its familiar groan, the iron hinges giving a soft complaint that echoes briefly along the wall walk, and he steps out onto the stone. His name is John, or perhaps it is not John, but something else that you have never needed to speak aloud, because on this wall names are less important than the simple fact of presence. He carries his bow in one hand, the yew dark with age and oil, and his quiver hangs from his shoulder with the strap crossing his chest, the way yours does. His tunic is the same undyed wool as yours, patched at one elbow with a square of darker cloth, and his hood is pushed back to reveal a face that the wind has weathered to the color of old oak. He nods once, a small dip of the chin that carries no urgency, and you return the nod with the same economy of motion. He crosses the wall walk with the easy balance of a man who has spent half his life on high stone, and when he reaches your side, he sets his bow against the merlon with a soft click of horn knock on limestone, the sound as familiar as the closing of a door in the house where you grew up. For a moment the two of you stand side by side, looking out at the same fields and the same river and the same empty road, and the silence between you is not the silence of strangers, but the silence of men who have shared 100 watches and have no need to fill the air with words. When he does speak, his voice is low and even, a sound almost indistinguishable from the wind that threads through the crenellations. He remarks on the cold, not as a complaint, but as a simple observation, the way someone might note that the river is running low, or that the rooks are flying late. You reply that the morning was colder, that the mist on the parapet was thick enough to wet your gloves through before the sun burned it off, and he nods again. A slow and thoughtful motion that suggests he is picturing the mist even as you describe it. There follows a small space of quiet, and then he asks about the state of the bread in the kitchens, a question that might seem trivial to anyone who has not stood on a wall for hours, but which carries real weight here. You tell him that the baker's boy brought a fresh loaf this morning, still warm from the oven, and that the crust had the right chewiness without being too hard, the crumb dense and dark and tasting faintly of the rye fields to the north. He listens with the attention of a man who understands that small comforts are the only comforts a wall offers, and then he tells you that yesterday's bread was dry, that it crumbed too easily and left a dust on his tunic that the wind would not blow away. The two of you consider this difference in bread quality with the solemnity that men in other trades might reserve for matters of law or trade, and then the subject passes. He leans one shoulder against the merlon, settling into a posture of rest that still allows him to watch the horizon, and he asks about the shoulder, the left one, the one that aches when the weather turns damp. This is a question that requires no explanation, because both of you carry the same ache from the same motion repeated 10,000 times. The drawing of the bowstring to the anchor point beside the jaw, the strain gathering in the joint like water seeping into a crack in stone. You tell him that the shoulder is quiet today, that the ache is there, but sleeping, a small dull presence that you notice only when you think about it. The cold, you say, seems to keep it quiet, whereas the damp stirs it awake and makes it grumble through the whole watch. He nods, a man who knows exactly what you mean, and he tells you that his own shoulder has been silent for a week now, ever since the last rain passed, and that he is grateful for the respite. The two of you speak in this way for a while, your voices rising and falling in a rhythm that matches the slow pulse of the afternoon, the words themselves less important than the sound of them. You talk about the cold and the bread and the shoulder, and then you talk about the sheep on the distant hill, and how they have moved since the morning, creeping farther up the slope until they are almost at the crest. You talk about the smoke from the kitchen chimney and how it leans differently when the wind shifts, a thing that both of you have noticed but never spoken of before. You talk about the raven that perched on the dead elm at dawn, and whether it is the same raven that nested in the gatehouse tower last spring, the one with the missing feather in its tail that makes it fly with a slight wobble. The conversation is not a conversation in the way that other people have conversations, with their quick exchanges and their sharp laughter and their need to fill every pause. It is a slower thing, a sharing of observations that drift up like bubbles in a still pond, each one allowed its full moment before the next one rises. Sometimes a full minute passes between one remark and the next, and neither of you feels the need to bridge the gap with idle noise. The silence is as much a part of the talk as the words are, a shared understanding that on this wall there is no hurry and no lack of time. He shifts his weight now, moving a few inches to the left so that his shoulder rests against a different part of the merlon, and you notice that his gloves are new, the leather still stiff and pale at the seams where the stitches have not yet been darkened by sweat and weather. You remark on the gloves, and he tells you that the old ones finally wore through at the thumb, that the leather split along the crease and let in the cold so sharply that his whole hand went numb within the hour. He had to barter with the glove-maker in the lower ward, offering a week's extra watch in exchange for the new pair because his coin had gone to mend his second pair of boots. You nod at this, knowing the economy of the castle and the way that men trade their time for the things they need, and you look at your own gloves, which are wearing thin at the same crease, and you file the knowledge away for later. The light continues its slow decline, the pale gold of midday giving way to a softer, more amber tone that deepens the shadows on the fields and turns the river into a ribbon of dark bronze. John, or the man you think of as John, notices the light at the same moment you do, and he gestures with his chin toward the western sky, where a thin band of cloud has begun to take on a faint wash of ochre between its lower edge and the horizon. You follow his gaze and see what he sees, a promise of evening still hours away, and you both watch it for a long moment without speaking. Then he straightens, pushing himself away from the merlon with a small grunt of effort that speaks of knees as tired as your own, and he retrieves his bow from where it leans against the stone. His watch on this stretch of the wall is the eastern section, 2 embrasures down from yours, where the parapet jogs outward to form a small bastion that gives a wider view of the road as it emerges from the woodland. He tells you that he will be there if the road shows anything, and you tell him that the road has shown nothing all day except a cart and a fox. And he receives this information with the same calm acceptance that he receives the cold and the bread and the ache in his shoulder. He walks away with the slow, careful tread of a man who knows that the wall does not forgive a misstep, his bow held loose in his left hand and his quiver bumping gently against his hip. You watch him go, the dark shape of his back moving along the wall walk until it reaches the bastion and stops, and then you see him settle into his own posture of watching, his silhouette merging with the silhouette of the Merlin, becoming another part of the castle's architecture. The distance between you is no more than 50 paces, and you can still see him if you turn your head, but there is a sense now of being alone again, the brief companionship having passed like a warm current in a cold sea. You return your eyes to the view, the same view that you have watched all day, and you find that the conversation has left a small residue of comfort behind, a faint warmth in the chest that has nothing to do with the sun. The words you exchanged were ordinary words, the kind that are spoken every day in every castle in the land, but they carry a weight that goes beyond their meaning. To speak of bread and cold and aching shoulders is to acknowledge that you are not alone on this wall, that there are other men who stand and watch and feel the same small discomforts, and that acknowledgement is a kind of thread that binds the garrison together more securely than any oath or command. You adjust your own posture, shifting your weight so that it falls more evenly on both feet, and you let the memory of the conversation settle into the back of your mind where it will stay for the rest of the watch. The words themselves will fade as words always do, but the feeling of them will remain, a quiet assurance that when the next watch comes and you descend the stair to your pallet in the barrack room, someone else will be standing here, looking at the same fields and the same river and the same empty road, carrying the same vigilance forward into the night. The wind stirs again, a little colder now, and you pull your hood forward until the wool cups your ears and muffles the sound of the air moving through the arrow loops. The bread and cheese that you ate earlier have settled into a comfortable weight in your stomach, and your shoulder is quiet, and the road is empty, and the afternoon stretches before you in a long, slow arc that will eventually curve into evening. You think of John at his post, 50 paces to the east, and you know that he is thinking of you at yours, and this mutual knowing is enough, a silent conversation that continues even after the speaking has ended. The light turns softer in the space of a long exhale, a wide cloud moving across the sun and pulling a veil of pewter over the afternoon. The change is subtle at first, a dimming so gentle that you might have missed it if you had been looking at the fields instead of the stone in front of you. But the stone knows the difference and shows it in the way the shadows lose their sharp edges and become indistinct, blurring at the borders, like charcoal smudged with a thumb. The temperature drops by a fraction, enough that the back of your neck feels the absence of the sun before your mind registers the cloud, and you draw your hood a little closer around your chin without thinking about it. You find yourself turning your attention away from the landscape and toward the wall itself, the stone that has been under your hands and at your back since before dawn. The parapet is made of blocks of grey limestone, each one roughly squared by the masons who cut them from the quarry that lies a day's walk to the north, and the blocks are set with thin joints of lime mortar that has aged to the colour of old bone. The surface of each block is not smooth but textured, carrying the marks of the toove that shaped it, the fine parallel grooves left by the chisel, the shallow dimples where the stone split along a fault line, the occasional fossil of a tiny shell that was pressed into the limestone when this rock was still mud at the bottom of a warm sea that has long since vanished. You have looked at these stones 1,000 times, but you have never really looked at them, not the way you are looking now. You lift one hand from its resting place on the parapet and bring your fingertips to the mortar line that runs horizontally between 2 blocks at the level of your chest. The mortar is rougher than the stone, a gritty surface made of crushed lime and sand and something organic that the masons long ago mixed in, hair from a horse's tail or the chaff from threshed grain, and it has weathered over the years into a texture that reminds you of the crust on the rye bread you ate earlier. You trace the mortar line from left to right, feeling the small irregularities beneath your glove, the tiny pockets where rain has worn shallow depressions over decades of autumns and springs, the cracks that have formed where the wall has settled into the earth and adjusted its weight against the hillside. One crack is wider than the others, a gap the thickness of a knife blade that runs for the length of a hand and then stops where the stone on the right is set a fraction higher than its neighbor, and you run your finger along its edge, feeling how smooth the inside of the crack has become from water flowing through it and carrying away the loose grains. At the corner where two blocks meet, the mortar has crumbed away entirely, leaving a hollow the size of a thumbprint that some small creature might once have used as a shelter, a spider perhaps, or a single bee seeking winter quarters. The hollow is deep enough to cast a shadow even in the diffuse light, a dark pocket that holds a grain of wind-blown sand and a tiny fragment of dried moss no larger than a lentil. You probe the hollow with the tip of your gloved finger and find that it is dry inside, the dust soft as flour against the leather, and you withdraw your finger and wipe the dust on the edge of the merlon, watching it scatter into the air and drift away over the outer wall. Above the mortar line, on the face of the block that forms the merlon to your right, a patch of grey-green lichen spreads in a pattern like a map of islands on a pale sea. The lichen is a living thing, though it grows so slowly that a man could watch it his whole life and never see it change, and it clings to the stone with a grip that is both gentle and relentless, its edges curling slightly where the dry air has shrunken it back from the surface. The texture of the lichen is different from the texture of the stone, softer and more yielding, and when you press your thumb against it, the surface gives slightly and then springs back when you remove the pressure, like a thin cushion of felt laid over the limestone. The color is the color of sage leaves that have been dusted with road chalk, a soft muted green that looks grey in one light and green in another, and it spreads along the seam between two blocks where the mortar is slightly damper than elsewhere, following the moisture the way a vine follows a trellis. A single strand of dried moss clings to the edge of the lichen patch, its tiny leaves curled and brown, the stem brittle as glass. You touch it with the tip of your finger, and it trembles with a motion so fine that it might be the beating of your own pulse transmitted through the stone, a vibration too small to see, but large enough to feel. The moss has been dead since last summer, killed by the drought that shriveled the grass on the hillsides and turned the river into a trickle between the gravel beds. But it still holds on, its rootlets dug into the microscopic crevices of the mortar with a grip that the wind and the rain have not yet broken. You think of pulling it free, of letting it blow away over the wall and become part of the dust that settles on the fields below, but something stays your hand, a sense that the moss has earned its place here and that your duty is to observe rather than to disturb. Your finger continues its slow journey along the stone, moving upward now to trace the outline of a single block that was cut differently from the others. While most of the blocks are rectangular, their edges straight and their corners square, this one has a slight curve along one side where the mason followed a natural fissure in the rock rather than cutting against it. The curve is gentle, no more than the sweep of a shallow bowl, and it creates a small recess in the wall that catches the light from a different angle, making the stone appear lighter on one side and darker on the other. You fit the palm of your hand into the curve, and it cups your palm as neatly as a saddle cupped a rider. The fit so natural that you wonder if the mason shaped it this way on purpose, or if centuries of hands resting in this very spot have worn the stone into a hollow that remembers every archer who ever stood here. The surface of this particular block has a different character as well, a finer grain that comes from being cut from a deeper layer of the quarry where the limestone was more compacted and the shell fossils fewer and smaller. Instead of the large scallop shapes that pattern some of the other blocks, this one holds only tiny specks of white, like a scattering of pinpricks on a sheet of slate, and the specks catch the soft grey light and gleam faintly, as if the stone were sweating tiny droplets of nacre. You run the edge of your thumbnail across the specks and feel no texture at all, just the smooth plane of the polished rock, the fossils having been cut clean through and smoothed flat by the mason's finishing stone. The cold of the stone has begun to seep through your gloves now, a slow transfer of heat from your skin into the ancient rock that will continue until the two reach an equilibrium that leaves your fingers chilled but not numb. You know this cold well, having felt it on 100 watches before this one, and you welcome it as a familiar companion rather than an adversary. The cold is a thing that keeps you awake and anchored in your body, a constant low hum of sensation that reminds you that you are here and alive and watching. Even if watching means nothing more than examining the geology of a wall that will outlast every person who has ever touched it. You shift your position slightly, moving a step to the left so that you can examine a different section of the wall, the inner face that faces the ward rather than the fields. Here the stone is darker, having been sheltered from the sun and the wind for all the years since the castle was built, and the surface is covered in a finer dust that has settled out of the air and clung to every protrusion. The mortar on this side is in better condition, the joints still full and smooth where the outer joints have crumbed and pitted, and the lichen grows in thicker, more spreading colonies, fed by the moisture that rises from the ward below and condenses on the cool stone in the night. You notice a patch of what looks like soot near the base of one merlon, a dark smear that runs downward from a gap in the crenellation where a torch must once have been wedged during a night watch long ago, the smoke staining the stone in a permanent shadow that no rain can wash away. The soot has a greasy texture when you touch it, a residue of the animal fat that fueled the torch, and it leaves a faint black mark on the tip of your glove that you rub away on the thigh of your trousers, where it disappears into the darker wool. You think about the archer who stood here on that night, perhaps 100 years ago, and held a torch in this very embrasure while he watched the darkness for a threat that may or may not have come. That man is dust now, his name forgotten even in the castle he guarded, but the mark of his torch remains, a signature without a name, and you feel a quiet kinship with him as you stand in the same space and look out at the same fields. The afternoon continues to deepen around you, the clouds still covering the sun and the light holding steady at its soft grey tone, and the slow inspection of the stone has drawn you into a state of mind that is almost a trance. Time is no longer a sequence of hours measured by the sun, but a granular drift, each moment a small grain of sand falling through the neck of an endless glass. The shadows, which had been sharp-edged in the morning and then blurry in the early afternoon, have now shifted so fractionally that you can only perceive their movement by looking away and then looking back. And you do this occasionally, a small game you play with yourself to mark the passage of the day. The texture of the stone under your palm becomes a constant, a steady pressure that you feel even when you stop consciously paying attention to it. And the lichen and the mortar and the soot and the fossils all blend into a single awareness of the wall as a living record, a book written in stone that tells the story of every season and every watch and every pair of hands that has ever touched it. Your own hands are now a part of that story, adding their small contribution of warmth and pressure and the faint oil from your skin. And this thought is not a proud one, but a peaceful one. A sense of fitting into a pattern that was here long before you and will be here long after you are gone. A sound reaches you from below, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer resuming after the midday pause, and it pulls you gently back from the edge of your reverie. You lift your eyes from the stone and look out again at the fields, which have not changed in any way you can see. The same strips of stubble and fallow, and the same silver bend of the river, and the same dark band of woodland on the eastern horizon. The cloud that covered the sun has begun to thin at its western edge, a brighter patch of light spreading slowly across the sky, and you know that the sun will break through again soon, and the shadows will sharpen, and the temperature will rise by a degree or two. You remove your hand from the stone and flex your fingers, feeling the slight stiffness that the cold has left in the joints, and you look at the section of wall you have been studying with a new appreciation, as if it were a painting you had just finished examining in a church. The lichen and the moss and the fossils and the soot are all still there, unchanged by your attention, and they will still be there tomorrow and the day after that, waiting for you or for another archer to notice them in the long quiet hours between dawn and dusk. You settle your weight onto both feet. Roll your shoulders once to loosen the small ache that has gathered between your shoulder blades, and return your hands to their accustomed place on the parapet, the rough stone familiar and welcoming beneath your gloves. The afternoon deepens, and the light that spills across the wall walk has lost its grey cast, the cloud having thinned enough to let through a wash of pale gold that makes the stone look warmer than it feels. You settle onto the wooden stool in the corner of the parapet, The same stool that has held you through so many watches that its seat has worn smooth in two shallow depressions that match the shape of your body. The quiver comes to rest across your knees, its weight a familiar pressure that spreads through your thighs and grounds you in the moment, and you loosen the drawstring with a single pull that you have made so often your fingers do it without instruction. The arrows rise a little as the mouth of the quiver opens, their grey goose feathers rustling against one another with a soft sound that belongs entirely to this place and this task. A sound like dry grass moving in a breeze too light to feel. You draw the first arrow free, lifting it clear of its companions with a care that has become instinct, and you hold it up against the sky where the light can travel along its length and reveal every detail of its making. The shaft is a wand of birch, pale and smooth, hand-planed by Fletcher, whose name you do not know, but whose work you have trusted for 3 years, and it catches the light in a way that makes the wood seem almost translucent at the edges, a faint glow of amber bleeding through the outer fibers. You turn the arrow between your fingers, rotating it slowly so that the fletching passes before your eyes, one feather at a time. The 3 grey goose feathers abound at the base and tip with fine linen thread that has been coated in a glue, now turned clear and hard, a glue that catches the light in tiny glints along the wraps. The thread lies in neat, tight coils, each loop pressed snug against the next without a single gap or overlap, and you run the ball of your thumb over the binding to test its smoothness. The thread is still firm, the glue still holding, and the feathers themselves are whole with only the normal ruffling that comes from being drawn from the quiver and pushed against their neighbours, the barbs slightly separated at the tips where the wind has teased them apart on 100 afternoons, just like this one. The grey of the feathers is not a single colour, but a complex blend of tones that shifts as you rotate the arrow, pale ash at the base darkening to a soft charcoal at the tips, with a faint iridescence that catches the light at certain angles and turns it into a shimmer of green and purple before fading back to grey. The barbs are fine and flexible, and you run the edge of your thumb up the length of one feather, feeling them spring back into place after your touch with a tiny creaking sound that is more a sensation than a noise. The feather remembers its shape, as feathers do, and by the time your thumb reaches the tip, the vein lies smooth and true again, ready to steer the arrow through the air in a straight and steady line. The knock at the base of the arrow draws your attention next, a small slot cut into the birch and reinforced with a slip of horn that has been shaped to fit the slot exactly. The horn is the colour of dark honey, translucent at its thinnest edges, and it has been glued into place with a care that leaves no visible seam between the horn and the wood. You hold the knock up close to your eye, sighting through the slot as if it were a tiny window, and you find it clean and unchipped with the horn still firmly seated against the end grain of the shaft. The slot itself is the width of your bowstring, no wider, and its edges are smooth from the Fletcher's fine file, a tool that leaves a surface as polished as old ivory. One knock catches your eye differently from the others, a tiny splinter rising from the edge where the birch meets the horn, no larger than a grain of barley, and you pause to examine it. The splinter is the kind of small flaw that can catch a bowstring and fray it over time, so you reach to the pouch on your belt and retrieve a small smooth file with a handle of wrapped leather, darkened by the oil of your hands. The file is no longer than your little finger, its surface worn almost flat from years of use, but it still holds enough bite to do the work. You place the arrow across your knees, bracing the shaft with your left hand while your right guides the file against the ray splinter with a gentle scraping motion. The file makes a soft hiss as it bites into the wood, a whisper of sound that would be lost in any place, louder than this wall, and the splinter curls away in a tiny shaving so fine it is almost transparent. You blow on the knock, a soft puff of air that lifts the shaving away and sends it spinning off the edge of the parapet, and then you run your thumb over the spot to test the smoothness. The wood is now as even as the rest of the knock, the transition from birch to horn seamless once more, and you set the file back into its pouch with a small pat that is half habit and half gratitude. The shaft itself demands a different kind of inspection, one that involves closing one eye and sighting down its length against the line of the parapet, checking for any warp or bend that might have crept in since the last watch. The birch is straight, a true line from knock to pile, and when you rotate the arrow and sight along it again, the line remains true, No curve or twist to send the point wandering from its intended path. The wood has a faint luster where your fingers have handled it most, a polishing that comes from being drawn from the quiver and knocked onto the string and held against the bow in the cold morning air. And this luster is a map of all the hours you have spent holding this particular arrow, ready to let it fly. The arrowhead is a simple bodkin point of forged iron, a square tang driven deep into the shaft and secured with a ferrule of the same metal. You check the ferrule for tightness, giving it a gentle twist between your thumb and forefinger, and it does not move. The tang's still firm in its bed of birchen glue. The point itself is sharp, a neat cone that tapers to a dull gleam, and you run your thumb across its surface to feel for any nick or burr. There is a tiny spot of rust near the tip, an orange freckle no bigger than a poppy seed, and you polish it away with the cuff of your sleeve, the wool scratching softly against the iron until the freckle disappears and the metal glints clean again. The smell of the iron rises faintly, a dry metallic tang that mingles with the smell of the birch and the feathers and the glue, and it is the smell of readiness. You return the first arrow to the quiver with the same care that you drew it, and you take up the second arrow, beginning the sequence again. Nock, fletching, shaft, head, and then back. The repetition of the task becomes a rhythm, each arrow inspected with the same methodical slowness, and the rhythm carries you along like a boat on a still canal, moving without any sense of hurry toward a destination that is simply the end of the quiver. The light shifts across your hands as you work, the sun having broken through the thinning cloud, and now casting a soft shadow of the arrow across your knees, a shadow that sharpens and blurs as the cloud moves overhead. By the time you have inspected 6 arrows, you have settled so deeply into the task that the rest of the world has receded to a faint hum at the edge of your awareness. The distant hammer of the smithy and the murmur of voices in the ward, and the wind threading through the crenellations, all blending into a single quiet background that requires no attention. Your hands move with a sureness that belongs to them alone, while your mind drifts in a space between focus and dream, touching on the grey of the feathers, the shine of the birch, the small weight of each arrow as it rests in your palm. One of the arrows has a feather with a slight kink near its tip, a bend in the vein where the barb has been folded back against itself, and you pause to address it. You moisten the tip of your thumb with your tongue and smooth it along the kinked barb, and the moisture is enough to soften the feather and let you reshape it, coaxing it back into alignment with its neighbors until the vein lies flat and true once more. The feather remembers its shape with a soft creaking sound, and when you hold the arrow up to the light again, the kink is gone, as if it had never been. Another arrow has a loose end on the linen thread at the base of the fletching, a stray fiber no longer than a grain of barley that has worked itself free of the glue. You pinch the fiber between your nails and pull it gently, and it comes away without resistance, leaving the binding tight and clean. The fiber drifts from your fingers and catches the breeze, spinning away over the inner edge of the wall, and you watch it descend in a slow spiral until it disappears against the grey cobbles of the ward. The arrow goes back into the quiver, its small flaw corrected, and you reach for the next. The smell of the birch shafts rises around you as you work, a dry and faintly sweet scent that reminds you of the carpentry shop in the lower ward, and the way the fresh shavings curl up from the plane in long, fragrant ribbons. The shafts are all from the same batch, cut from the same stand of birch that grows along the river to the north, and they share the same pale color and the same fine grain, the same slight give when you press your thumbnail into the wood. They are good shafts, well seasoned and true, and they have served you without complaint through 3 winters of practice and patrol. When you have inspected all 24 arrows, you line them up across your knees, their points facing the same direction, their feathers aligned so that the grey veins all lean at the same angle. The sight of them arranged this way is satisfying in a quiet, wordless manner, the way a row of planted beans is satisfying, or a stack of cut firewood, a small order imposed on the world with care and patience. You count them once, touching each arrow on the shaft as your lips move silently through the numbers, and the count comes to 24, the same as it was this morning, the same as it was yesterday, the same as it will be tomorrow, if no trouble comes. You slide the arrows back into the quiver one by one, hearing the soft hollow sound of the shafts settling against each other, and the muffled thump as the pile points touch the bottom. The quiver is full again, its weight complete, and you draw the string tight with the same knot you have tied since you were a boy. A simple loop and pull that never slips, but always releases with a single tug. You set the quiver upright against the embrasure where it can be reached in a single motion, and you stand from the stool with the same slow unfolding of your limbs that a cat uses when it rises from a long nap. The inspection has taken perhaps an hour, perhaps a little more, and the afternoon has moved imperceptibly toward its close, while you were absorbed in the feathers and the knocks and the straight lines of the birch. The sun is lower now, its light slanting across the wall, walk at a sharper angle and painting long shadows behind the merlons, and the air has taken on the first hint of the evening chill that will deepen as the light fails. You stretch your arms above your head, feeling the pull in your shoulders where the drawing muscles live, and then you let your hands fall back to the parapet, the rough stone cool and steady beneath your palms. The arrows are ready, the bow is ready, and you are ready. A state of readiness that has become so habitual that it feels like the natural condition of existence. You have checked every detail, corrected every small flaw, and returned each piece of your equipment to its proper place, and the quiet satisfaction of work completed settles over you like a second tunic, warm and familiar. The road beyond the fields remains empty, the river continues its slow meander, and the afternoon drifts onward into the long, still hour before evening, carrying you with it as gently as the river carries a fallen leaf. Far across the valley, from somewhere beyond the river and the watermill and the low stone walls, the little bell of a village church begins to toll. The sound reaches you not as a sudden announcement, but as a slow seepage through the still air. A series of measured notes, each one rising from the unseen tower, and crossing the fields with a clarity that the warmer air of midday would have swallowed. The bell is small, a single bronze instrument hanging in a wooden frame, and its voice is high and thin, a silver thread drawn through the grey fabric of the afternoon. You do not count the strikes, or if you do it, is only the counting that the body performs without the mind, a quiet tally kept somewhere in the pulse or the breath. The first note hangs in the air for a long moment, fading so slowly that you cannot say exactly when it ceases to be sound and becomes memory. The second note follows after a pause that feels neither too short nor too long, a gap measured by the rhythm of a bell ringer who has done this work for 40 years and whose arm knows the weight of the rope as intimately as your arm knows the weight of the bow. The third note blends with the second before it has fully faded, and then the fourth and the fifth, until the sound becomes a continuous wash of bronze that rolls across the fields like a slow tide, touching the castle wall and then receding, touching and receding, each wave a little fainter than the last. You let the sound of the bell fill your ears, and as it does you become aware that your body has recognized the hour in some quiet way that precedes thought. The tolling marks the turning of the day, the point at which afternoon begins its slow dissolve into evening, and though you have not been watching the sun or measuring the shadows, you know this time as surely as you know the feel of the bow in your hand. The bell is simply a confirmation of what your bones have already told you, a gentle reminder that the watch has entered its final phase and that the light will soon begin its long retreat toward the western hills. When the last strike fades into the grey air, the silence that follows is deeper than the silence that came before, as if the bell has carved a hollow in the afternoon and left it empty. The rooks in the distant wood pause in their cawing as if listening, and even the wind seems to hold its breath for a moment, before resuming its slow threading through the arrow loops. You stand in this deepened quiet and feel it settle over your shoulders like a cloak, a stillness that is both outside you and within, and you let your own breathing slow to match the rhythm of the world after the bell. The light has begun its slow decline, the pale gold of the afternoon giving way to a softer wash of ochre that stretches along the western sky where the cloud has broken apart into a series of long, thin bands. The sun, still hidden behind the thicker portion of the cloud, makes itself known through the color it leaves on the horizon, a hue that is not quite yellow and not quite rose, but something between the two, the color of a ripe pear or the inside of a seashell. The fields below you take on this same color, the brown stubble warming to amber and the fallow strips deepening to a rich burnt umber, and the river becomes a ribbon of dark bronze that catches the last of the afternoon and holds it in a long, still gleam. The shadows that the merlons cast across the wall walk have stretched now, reaching out to touch the inner edge of the parapet and spilling over into the ward beyond. Your own shadow has become a long, thin version of yourself, a dark shape that falls across the wall walk and climbs the opposite merlon before disappearing over the top, and you watch its slow movement with the same detached interest that you would give to the shadow of a sundial. The shadow is your companion, proof that you are still here and still standing, and it moves only when you move, which is not often. The flock of starlings that has been gathering in the copse beyond the river lifts now, not all at once but in a series of small eruptions, a dozen birds here and a dozen there, until the whole flock is airborne and wheeling above the treetops. Their movement is not random but fluid, a single organism made of 1,000 individual parts, and they turn and rise and fall with a coordination that seems to require no leader, as if they are all thinking the same thought at the same moment. The flock circles the copse once, a dark cloud against the pale sky, and then it swirls outward and upward, describing a shape that is almost a question mark, before folding back on itself and settling into the treetops with a soft rush of wings. The whole event has lasted no more than a minute, and when it is over, the copse looks exactly as it did before, as if the starlings had been a thought that the woodland entertained and then released. You watch the copse for a while after the starlings have settled, half expecting them to rise again, but they do not. The woodland returns to its stillness, a dark mass of bare branches that holds the last of the afternoon light in its upper reaches, and the only movement is the slow drift of a single rook crossing from one tree to another with a few heavy flaps of its wings. The river continues its quiet progress. The watermill remains motionless, and the road is still an empty, pale line that curves into the woodland and disappears. Nothing has changed, and yet everything has changed, because the light is different now, and the bell has rung, and the day has turned its corner. You adjust the strap of your bracer, the leather guard that wraps around your left forearm, to protect it from the snap of the bowstring, and the motion is so familiar that your fingers complete it without any direction from your mind. The bracer has shifted slightly during the long hours of standing, and you work it back into its proper position, tightening the buckle by one hole and smoothing the leather against your sleeve. The bracer is the same dark brown as your gloves, tooled with a simple line of dots along its edge, and it has a groove worn into the inner side where the bowstring has slapped it 1,000 times in practice. You run your thumb along the groove, feeling the smooth depression that your own repeated action has created, and then you let your hand fall back to the parapet. The air has cooled more rapidly in the last quarter hour. The sun's retreat from the horizon, taking the last of the day's warmth with it, and you feel the cold settling into the stone beneath your palms and into the wool of your tunic. The cold is not the sharp, biting cold of a winter dawn, but a gentler, more pervasive coolness that rises from the earth and seeps into everything it touches, the kind of cold that makes a man grateful for his hood and his gloves and the knowledge that the watch is nearing its end. You pull your hood a little closer and settle your shoulders against the crenellation, feeling the roughness of the stone through the wool, and you let your gaze sweep across the horizon with the same slow, patient arc that it has followed all day. The fields are emptying of light now, the farthest reaches already sinking into a soft blue dusk that creeps toward you across the land like a tide filling a bay. The hedgerows that were pale lines in the morning are now dark smudges, and the low stone walls have merged with the shadows they cast, becoming invisible against the earth. The sheep on the distant hill are still visible as tiny pale shapes against the darkening grass, but they have stopped moving and are standing still, their heads lowered, their bodies settling into the long rest that will carry them through the night. The river still catches a faint gleam where the sky reflects in its surface, but the gleam is dimmer now, the color of tarnished pewter rather than bright silver. You think of the other archers, who will soon climb the stair to take the night watch, the men who are now finishing their evening meal in the barracks and pulling on their extra layers against the cold. You think of John at his post 50 paces to the east, whose silhouette you can still see against the fading sky, a dark shape that has not moved for the better part of an hour. You wonder if he heard the bell as you did, and felt the same quiet recognition of the hour, and you suspect that he did, because he has been standing on this wall as long as you have, and his body knows its rhythms as well as your own. You do not call out to him, because there is no need, and the silence between you continues to hold its own conversation. The smoke from the kitchen chimney rises straight into the still air, a column of pale grey that turns golden where it catches the last of the light and then dissolves into the darkening sky. The smell of the smoke reaches you in thin ribbons, carrying the scent of roasting meat and boiling pottage, and the sharp tang of the applewood that the cook favours for the evening fire. The smell is the smell of the end of the day, the smell of food and warmth and rest, and it tugs at something deep in your chest, a longing not for anything specific, but for the simple comfort of the barracks and the pallet, and the sound of the other archers breathing in the dark. The western sky continues its slow transformation, the ochre deepening to a soft copper and then to a shade that is almost rose, a thin band of color that lies along the horizon like a ribbon laid across the edge of the world. Above that band the sky is a pale lavender that grades upward into the soft charcoal of the cloud. And above the cloud the first stars are beginning to prick through the deeper blue of the upper sky. Tiny points of light that you can only see if you look at them indirectly. You do look at them, tilting your head back and letting your eyes adjust to the darkening dome above, and you find the familiar constellations that have marked the winter sky since before the castle was built. The same patterns that the first watcher on this wall looked up at on the first night of the first watch 150 years ago. The evening comes, not as a dramatic event, but as a gradual thickening of the air, a deepening of the shadows, a cooling of the stone. The world below you has become a landscape of soft blues and deep greys, the colours of the painting made with watered ink, and the outlines of the fields and the hedgerows and the woodland have begun to blur and merge. You can no longer see the sheep on the hill, or the individual trees in the copse, only the broad shapes of the land, the dark mass of the woodland, and the pale curve of the road, and the long, slow gleam of the river under the last light of the sky. The view is beautiful in a way that you have never tried to put into words, a beauty that comes from stillness and patience, and the long familiarity of watching the same land fall into darkness, night after night. You settle deeper into your posture, your shoulders relaxing against the stone, and you let the evening wash over you with the same acceptance that you let the morning mist and the afternoon cloud and the distant bell. There is nothing more to do now, nothing to check or adjust or observe, only the final hour of the watch to stand and the slow turning of the sky to witness. The siege has not come today, and you are almost certain it will not come tonight, though you will not say this aloud, because to say it would be to invite the thing you have not spoken. Instead, you stand in the gathering dusk and feel the weight of the day lifting from you, replaced by the quiet anticipation of the torches being lit and the stair door opening and the familiar voice of the next watch telling you that you can go down now, that your turn is done, that the night belongs to someone else. The evening comes not as a sudden change, but as a slow accumulation of small darknesses, each one adding to the last until the world below the wall has become a study in deep blue and soft grey. The air thickens with the cooling of the stone, and you feel the parapet give back the day's stored warmth in a barely perceptible breath, a faint movement of heat that rises past your cheeks and vanishes into the dusk. Your hands are still on the stone, but the stone no longer feels like a solid thing separate from yourself. It feels like an extension of your own stillness, a part of the watch that you have carried since before dawn and will carry a little longer until the relief comes. The sky above the western hills has now lost its ochre and copper tones, fading through a brief wash of pale green into the deep indigo that spreads from the east like ink poured into clear water. The stars that you saw pricking through the upper sky have multiplied, the fainter ones becoming visible as the darker the sky grows, and the constellations have taken on their full winter sharpness, each star a point of cold light that looks near enough to touch, but is farther away than any road you will ever walk. You search for the constellation that the old beer once showed you, the one shaped like an arrow flying toward the north, and you find it just above the dark mass of the woodland, its shaft straight and its point clear in the frosty air. In the ward below you, a small movement catches the corner of your eye, and you turn your head to see two figures emerge from the doorway of the gatehouse and begin their slow progress from bracket to bracket along the inner wall. Each carries a long taper, a wooden rod tipped with a wad of oiled cloth that has been dipped in tallow, and they pause at each iron bracket, touching the flame to the waiting torches with the careful precision of men who have done this every evening of their service and could do it blindfolded if the need arose. The first torch catches with a soft whump of sound that you cannot hear from this height but can imagine, a sudden bloom of orange light that pushes back the shadows in a circle around the bracket and casts long, wavering shapes across the cobbles. The second torch follows, and then the third, each one opening a pool of warm light along the inner wall, a chain of small suns that marks the boundary of the lower ward. The smoke from the torches rises in thin, straight columns, the night air too still to bend them, and the columns climb to the level of the wall walk and then spread outward into a faint haze that carries the smell of burning tallow and hemp and hot iron. The smell reaches you as a distant reminder of other nights, of hearths and candles, and the small flames that people gather around when the day's work is done, and it stirs a quiet anticipation in your chest, the knowledge that soon you will descend into that warmth and leave the cold wall to the night watch. The two figures continue their circuit, moving along the inner wall to the far corner where the stables stand, then turning and working their way back toward the kitchen. The torchlight throws their shadows against the stone in giant, distorted versions of themselves, shadows that stretch and contract and slide along the masonry with a liquid motion, and you watch their progress the way you might watch a candle flame in a dark room, your eyes drawn to the light without any need to look away. By the time they reach the kitchen door, the whole lower ward is a pattern of orange circles and black spaces between. The light and dark arranged in a geometry that changes slightly as the torch flames flutter in a breeze, too light for you to feel. The parapet beneath your hams has grown distinctly cold now, the last of the stored warmth having bled away into the evening air, and you lift your gloved fingers one by one, flexing them to bring the blood back to the tips. The leather of your gloves creaks softly with the motion, a sound that is swallowed by the larger quiet before it can travel more than a few inches, and you feel the familiar prickle of returning sensation in your fingertips, a mild tingling that is one of the small discomforts that the watch brings and that the watch will take away again when you are back in the barracks. You think of the pallet waiting for you, the straw mattress and the wool blanket, and the particular hollow in the straw that your body has worn over months of sleeping, and the thought warms you more than any torch could. The sound of footsteps rises through the stone once more, this time from the stair that leads up from the ward rather than down from the tower, and you recognize the rhythm of them, the heavy tread of the man who will take your place. The footsteps pause on the landing where the stair turns, and you hear the scrape of a shoulder against the wall, the small grunt as someone adjusting his quiver in the narrow space, and then the footsteps resume, climbing the last turn and approaching the wooden door at the head of the stair. The door opens with its familiar groan, and the new watcher steps out onto the wall walk, his breath making a cloud in the cold air, his bow held loose in his hand, and a fresh torch jammed into a bracket beside the door. He is a man whose name you know but rarely speak, a younger archer who came to the castle 2 summers ago and has since learned the rhythms of the wall with a quiet aptitude that you respect. He nods to you, the same nod you gave to John in the afternoon, and you nod back, the same economy of motion passing between you. He crosses to where you stand and sets his bow against the merlon beside yours, the 2 bows leaning together like old friends who need no words, and he looks out at the darkening fields with the same slow sweep of the eyes that you have used all day, taking in the road and the river and the woodland, and finding them all as they should be. You exchange a few words with him, the same kind of words you exchanged with John about the cold that has settled into the stone, and the bread that was still warm when the baker's boy brought it at mid-morning, and the sheep on the hill that have moved closer to the crest over the course of the afternoon. He listens with the attention of a man who will stand in this very spot for the next 4 hours, and who wants to know everything that the day has held, even if the day has held nothing at all. You tell him that the road has been empty since the cart passed in the morning, that the rooks have been quiet for the last hour, that the bell in the village tolled an hour ago, and nothing followed it. He receives this information with a slow nod, and then he settles his weight onto both feet and places his hands on the parapet in the exact spot where your hands have rested all day. You gather your bow and quiver, slinging the quiver over your shoulder and taking the bow in your left hand with the string facing inward so that the dew will not settle on it as you descend. The bow feels lighter now than it did this morning, or perhaps you are simply more tired than you were this morning, and the weight seems diminished by the prospect of rest. You tuck the stool under the inner wall, where it will wait for tomorrow's watch, and you check the spot where you sat to eat the bread and cheese, finding nothing left behind except the faint scatter of crumbs that the sparrow will find in the morning. You take one last look at the road and the fields and the river before you turn away. A final sweep of the horizon that is not a search for anything but a farewell, a recognition that the watch is ending and the world below will continue through the night without your eyes upon it. The fields are now a single dark expanse, the strips of stubble and fallow and turnip tops all merged into one deep blue-grey that stretches from the castle wall to the edge of the woodland. The river is visible only as a faint sheen where the starlight catches its surface, a thin line of silver that curves between the invisible alders and disappears into the dark mass of the mill. The road is a pale thread against the darker land, empty and still, climbing from the woodland mouth and crossing the open ground before vanishing behind the hill as it has done every night since the Romans laid its first stones. Nothing moves in all that spread of darkness, and you are glad of it. The woodland on the eastern horizon is now a solid wall of black, its individual trees lost to the night, and its canopy a rough line against the star-filled sky. No light comes from that direction. No flicker of a campfire or gleam of a distant torch, and the darkness there is the darkness of a landscape at peace, a place where the only watchers are the owls and the foxes and the small creatures that move through the undergrowth on silent feet. You think of the army that was rumored to be gathering beyond the woodland, the reason you have stood on this wall for weeks and months, and you realize with a quiet certainty that the siege did not come today. The realization is not a relief because there was no tension to relieve, only a gentle confirmation of what your body has known since the mist burned off the fields at dawn, that this day was always going to be a day of stillness, a day of bread and cheese and the distant tolling of a bell, a day of the wall and the sky and the slow drift of hours toward night. You turn from the parapet and cross the wall walk to the wooden door that leads to the stair, and you pause for a moment with your hand on the iron latch, feeling the cold of the metal through your glove. Behind you, the new watcher has settled into his post, his silhouette motionless against the starry sky, and you know that he will stand there through the first watch of the night and the second, watching the same darkness that you watched through the day, carrying the same quiet vigilance forward into the hours when the rest of the castle sleeps. The chain of watchers continues unbroken, hand to hand and watch to watch, a thread that stretches back to the first archer who stood on this wall and will stretch forward to the last, whenever that may be. You push open the door and step into the dark of the stairwell, the smell of damp stone and old lime wash rising to meet you, and you begin the slow descent, your hand trailing along the wall for balance and your feet finding the worn hollows in the steps with the ease of long practice. The sounds of the ward grow louder as you descend, the muffled voices of the kitchen servants, the clank of a pot being hung on its hook, the distant thump of the stable door closing for the night, and these sounds welcome you back from the high quiet of the wall into the warm and living heart of the castle. The stair turns once, twice, and then you are at the bottom, stepping out onto the cobbles of the lower ward where the torchlight paints everything in shades of orange and shadow, and the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat fills the air like a promise kept. You cross the ward with the slow walk of a man whose legs have been still for too long, and who is in no hurry to arrive anywhere, passing the kitchen door where the cook is shouting something good-natured about the consistency of the pottage, passing the smithy where the forge is now dark and cold and the tools are hung in their rows, passing the chapel where a single candle burns in the window and sends a thin blade of light across the grass. The barracks door is before you now, a heavy oak slab, banded with iron and propped slightly open to let out the warmth, and you push it wide and step into the long, low room where the other archers are settling onto their pallets for the night. The air inside is thick with the smell of wool and leather and the faint sweetness of the straw that covers the floor, and the hearth at the far end of the room holds a low fire that casts a gentle red glow across the rafters. You find your pallet in the corner where you left it before dawn, the blanket still rumpled from your rising, the straw still holding the ghost of your body's shape, and you set your bow on its pegs above the bed and your quiver on the floor beside it, with the arrows standing upright against the wall. You sit on the edge of the pallet and work your boots loose one at a time, the leather stiff and cold, and you set them side by side beneath the bed where they will wait for the morning. The other archers around you are speaking in low voices, sharing their own small observations about the day, the state of the bread, the ache in a shoulder, the way the light fell across the fields in the hour before evening, and their words blend into a gentle murmur that is as soothing as the sound of the wind through the arrow loops. You pull the wool blanket up around your shoulders and lie back on the pallet, feeling the straw shift beneath you and the long tiredness of the watch settle into every muscle, and you close your eyes, letting the warmth of the barracks and the murmur of voices and the distant crackle of the fire carry you towards sleep. The siege did not come today, and the road is empty, and the fields are dark, and somewhere above you on the wall a new watcher is standing at the parapet, looking out at the same river and the same woodland and the same patient, unbroken silence of the world, holding its breath through another peaceful night.